So in this video, I am going to give an overview really of the Major Astronist Mechanism 1. This is the Astrosoteriology and Astroeschatology of all humankind. What we really need to begin with first is right down there at the bottom where it says Comet of Life. So what this refers to is really the beginning of this story of humanity, and it's connected to the hypothesis of panspermia and the idea that humanity evolved from the microorganisms that came from a comet or a meteor or some type of extraterrestrial event. That life didn't just emerge from Earth itself, that it actually came from an extraterrestrial source. And so what this Comet of Life section there at the bottom is signifying is the beginning, really, of the human story. And as we're moving on through this story, up through this the column there, this is describing humanity's what we call Sideresis, the Sideresis. This is humanity's relations with the astronomical world. So even before humanity existed as a species, we had a relationship with the astronomical world because it is the astronomical world from where we came. Now let's move on to the next section there, the sort of the purple section. This is really, well, the blue section is relating to sort of a neutral existence, in a sense of a neutral position in the overall system. So it's not either for or against transcension. These are just things that have happened, whether that be by chance or by destiny or by coincidence. That is to be discussed, but these things have happened or will happen as an eventuality. That's what the blue section is referring to. So anything that is purple is referring to transcension or pro-transcension, and anything that is red, of course, sides with the controversion or anything that goes against the endeavours of transcension. So if we go back here to the scope of man, I've put in brackets there due to preferment. So if people don't know what the scope of man is, it refers to the first sort of the realization, really, that astronality exists. It's really the first time that humans looked up to the night sky and felt something and really began to relate what they saw in the night sky to their beliefs, to their identity, to how they saw the world. And this is what we call the scope of man, because this was the beginning of humanity's opportunities for transcension. So even back in prehistoric times, in the Stone Age, which is when the scope of man occurred, specifically in the Upper Paleolithic period of the Stone Age, among the Aurignacian culture, that's who we've narrowed it down to in our current knowledge of the archaeological record. This is where the opportunities of transcension began. Okay, if the people at that time had decided to go against astronality, to not engage in that, then we may not have the humanity that we have today. Scope in astronomism then is very much intertwined with the idea of humanity being a intelligent, but especially a distinct or unique in terms of the Earth species. It's connected to this idea of the transition between sentience to sapience. And really the connected section there, which is what we call enkindlement, is really the beginning. Again, it sort of builds on scope of man and is the first instance where really the astronality, which is emotional attachment to the night sky, was being connected to belief, art, identity. Okay, that's what we call the enkindlement. So those two occurrences are very much connected together, and they are very much, the enkindlement is very much a sort of subsequent, a consequence of the scope of man. We then move on to really what we call the controversion, which is a really important aspect of the Sideresis, because as you can see, it's made our little column there jut out a little bit. The reason for that is because the column as you see it is up to the enkindlement there is the proper way of transcension, is in many ways the sort of the correct course in a sense. And what the controversion did was it knocked that course, it dislodged that course, and devolved us into conditions where we began to see ourselves as gods, essentially. That's what controversion really refers to, is really anthropocentrism, basically. It's really considering humanity as superior to the astronomical world, as really considering humanity as having all the answers, essentially, kind of disregarding cosmocentricity, essentially, is what the controversion refers to. Anything that is contrarian, therefore, refers to any type of instance in which there is an aversion to cosmocentricity. And this has led to what we call the condition of antipode, okay, or antipodality. Anything that is in a box in this diagram refers to a condition of humankind rather than just a process. So the related condition to the occurrence of the controversion is what we call antipode. So being in antipode in a general sense means to be at distance from something, means to be sort of ignorant of something in many senses. And of course, what the controversion did to humanity was it essentially knocked us into this sort of ignorant position, and this is what Astronism is trying to get us out of. So the next three sections there, you can see we've moved back into transcension or pro-transcension dialogue. And what this is then saying is, through the recultivation, the reastration, and the potentialization, these are processes that are taking place right now because of Astronism's founding, essentially. Because of Astronism's founding, because of the work that we're doing, not just myself, but other people are doing in terms of getting people to think cosmocentrically, we're moving back into what we call a state of archaeology, a state of sort of guidedness again, this state of really humble self-understanding when it comes to the astronomical world, understanding that oneself really, you are very, very small, and also that that you're not really that important in the grand scheme of the universe, but that you have the scope. This is what really important here, that you have the scope to become important, that you have the scope to contribute to the endeavors of transcension. So again, this is the whole process of what Astronism is trying to do. It's trying to recultivate this original scope of man, this original cosmocentricity, often what we call peludicity, this sort of this pureness, this purity that we had back in prehistoric times before the controversion took over. This is what we had, and so this is what we want to try and get back to in order to really fix the controversion, essentially, is what Astronism is trying to do here. As you can see, reads there, Astronism resets humanity on the path to transcension. This is what we call the resumption. So this path was already set upon by the preferment of humanity during the scope of man, but because of the controversion, because of all these beliefs that are not getting us to transcension, that Astronism has had to come along in order to reset humanity along this path, in order to resume the endeavour of transcension, essentially. And this all leads to what we call the placement of man, or Astronism's placementation. And essentially what that's trying to say is that we're trying to place humanity in the right position so that it can make the decision that it needs to do at Twilightide to make that right decision to transcend to the astronomical world. That's what Astronism is trying to do. Getting humanity to that position, getting the humanity to that condition, that position where it can make that decision is what we call the supersedence of man, okay? And the supersedence of man is really signals really the success, or will signal, hopefully, the success of Astronism. That Astronism's placement of man has reached humanity to this position of supersedence, that we've got beyond the controversion, and that we can now make this decision at Twilightide that is coming, whether we like it or not. We can make the right decision for humanity. That is essentially what the supersedence is referring to. It's referring to the success of Astronism's placement of man in getting humanity to this condition where it can make this decision at Twilightide. So, of course, Twilightide there is probably one of the biggest words that I've put on there, and that is for a reason, because it is very important. Twilightide is the really crossroads that humanity will face in the future between Vesperia on this side and Evenfall on the other, okay? And this is the decision essentially to ascend to the stars or not, okay? And this is what we call the decision at Twilightide. What Astronism's trying to do is get humanity ready for that decision. That are we really ready to go up into the astronomical world in the right way? That's what Astronism is trying to promote. And of course, it's trying to get humanity to this condition where it can do that, where it can make the right decision. And as I've just said, there are those two options. We'll come back to what we call, you might see there's a third option there called star eyes. Just coming off there. That's a separate section that I'll focus on in a little while, because it brings in another type of belief, essentially. So we'll come back to that in a second. So we've got this decision here, but time is still moving. Time is not going to wait for us. Time will continue on, and our condition will also continue on. It's going to either get worse or get better. The eventuality, and this is where we're moving up there. We're moving up past that little blue blob there, moving up to what we call the sideria. Okay, sideria is essentially the closing of the opportunities for humanity to transcend into the astronomical world. Okay, so you can see there that we've kind of moved off from this ability to these arrows that are going into transcension, the purple part, and we've gone into this section we call sideria. So we've moved on from Twilightide, and now we're going into sort of the consequences of not choosing at Twilightide, not choosing that decision to transcend or to not transcend. Okay, and this is what we call sideria. So this is the closing of the scope window, essentially. And what this is referring to, of course, is the cessation of the opportunities for humanity to transcend to the astronomical world, essentially. And of course, what we believe in Astronism is that will lead to what we call the degradation, but more specifically, the devolution of man and our eventual extinction. Okay? And that's our own choice. No one else has made that for us. That is our own choice. If we don't choose to transcend, then that's what's going to happen. Okay, so, and time will go on, things will continue. We will continue, and things will progress still without us in that sense. So before we go into the two separate sections there, I'm just going to continue to finish this blue part. These are events that will take place whether we like it or not. So things like the Comet of Death, it's highly probable that another comet will come that, like the dinosaurs, will destroy all life on Earth, or will destroy parts of life on Earth, or that a great tumefaction will take place, which is essentially sort of either it generally relates to the sun expanding, which we know will take place, and eventually it will envelop the Earth. So that's when Earth will obviously be no longer. Humanity definitely doesn't want to still be here when that takes place. But also the Great Tumefaction can relate to lots of other sort of end time events, essentially. It's essentially referring to any instance in which humanity is destroyed by either itself or an astronomical event, essentially. And then, of course, we come to what we call the siberia, which is right at the top there of this blue column. And that's essentially the end of the cosmos. So that is the end of cosmic existence. Of course, we don't know when that will be, billions, trillions of years in the future. But that is an eventuality that the cosmos will end. So we need to consider that that is an eventuality, and that where are we going to be when that takes place is essentially what astronomism is trying to think about. So we've got to the end there. Those things are going to happen whether we like it or not. The blue column there, this is all as well integrated with time. This is how I've created this, is that you can see right at the bottom, if you look at the Comet of Life, that's talking about sort of billions of years in the past, when maybe a comet came and the microorganisms from that comet dispersed, and then that came into the evolution of man. So that's talking about billions of years ago. And then the siberia is talking about billions of years in the future. So this diagram really is very much chronological, and it's very much integrated with time into it. And I know that doesn't seem like it is because I've not put that on there, but these events that I'm talking about demonstrate that this is a very chronological understanding, and very much linear understanding. Not a cyclical understanding, a linear understanding of existence. Okay, so we have this sort of central column there, don't we? And then really what dominates this diagram is the two decisions, isn't it? It's either the decision of what we call the degradation there on the right-hand side, which is, of course, the red section. And it's this decision on the left-hand side that we call transcension, or the great struggle, which is, of course, the purple section, which then goes on to gold as we get up to the top of that. And, of course, you know, there is a lot of symbolism here as well. There is a reason why the degradation and all that is related to it has been put into red. And there's a reason why the arrows are pointing downwards for the degradation, because that's what it refers to. It refers to humanity devolving, essentially, eventually leading to what we call the starfall. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Let's just go back to what we call the Twilightide, which is, of course, this decision that we have in front of us to decide either are we going to go and transcend or are we not? If you move your eyes towards the left-hand side, the left bottom of the screen, the left-hand side bottom of the screen, you'll see views on humanity's current condition, okay? And these are 4 different understandings of where humanity is right now. Of course, Astronist orthodoxy believes that we're still in the controversion, and that astronism's placement of man still needs to take place in order for the Twilightide, in order for us really to make the right decision at Twilightide, essentially. But of course, there are those other 3 views on where humanity is right now. I'm not going to go through those right now, but what you just need to pay attention to those, because they are how people, different groups of astronists, view where we are right now, essentially. So let's begin with the degradation, because I think that is, of course, what we want to avoid. And the degradation is sort of this overall process of humanity's decision not to transcend, our devolution, our infighting, and all the horribleness that will take place at the crepusculis, which is not a nice word, and it's not supposed to be a nice word. It's not a nice thing. So that's why I've chosen that word for that, because it's not a great thing. And of course, we've got starfall right at the end, which is, of course, the extinction of humanity. So if we then, what it's been trying to say here is that if we get to the Twilightide, and we say to ourselves, no, we're not going to transcend. We're definitely not going to do that. It's going to be our decision that we're not going to do that. That's what we call evenfall. Okay. When we get to the sidereia, and you can see the arrow going up a little bit and then coming back down to the devolution of man, that is not our decision. Basically, what Astronism says is that if we don't make either one or two of those decisions, that it will be made for us, and that the default position of that natural process that will take place is the sidereia, is our devolution, if we don't make that decision in time. So again, there is a very much time chronological and very much a time temporal emphasis on all that is taking place here. There is a ticking top, there's a ticking clock that exists behind all of these words. The sidereia is going to close, and if we don't endeavour to transcend before that, it will lead to our devolution, whether we decide that or not. So that's the difference between those two things. That evenfall is very different from sidereia in that sense. That evenfall is actually the choice of not to transcend, which may well happen if Astronism doesn't become successful in its placementation. So let's say we've chosen this decision of evenfall, and we're at this decision and of course you can see that the prolepticist tradition, or the prolepticism view, is that humanity has already chosen this, that we've already chosen at Twilightide, we've already chosen not to transcend. But of course there's those arrows there that are pointing off, and what I've written there is that there is a possibility that exists for a reset to the placement of man in order to choose again at Twilightide if sidereia has not occurred. So essentially, that even if we make the decision of evenfall, that there's still that opportunity for us to go back to the placement of man, Astronism's placement of man, to listen to the placement of man, and then to choose that transcensional choice, of course. That is what evenfall, or that is what that little section there is trying to say, is that there is still that opportunity. That's what that arrow is pointing to, that there's still that opportunity to return to the transcensional path, essentially, even if we've chosen evenfall at that stage. So we've got to evenfall. This is just the decision that we're not going to transcend. We've made that decision. What astronists believe from there on is that we then go downwards, is that then we lead to what we call the devolution of man. Okay, this involves, of course, humanity's devolution in many ways, in both intelligence, physically, that we've reached our climax before we could really get up to the stars and really make most of that pinnacle energy that we have, that sort of that motivation that we have, that we've lost that, and that we will devolve and go down. But again, there is another arrow that is pointing out from that devolution of man, and of course that is pointing back towards Astronism's placement of man, which again provides this opportunity by means of scope that I've written there, saying that we still, even at the stage of the devolution of man, we still will have that opportunity to get back to the placement of man if we choose to do that by means of the opportunities that we still have. So even when we've chosen evenfall, even if we get to the devolution of man, there is still the opportunity for transcension. There is still that opportunity, okay? And that opportunity will continue to exist. Of course, there will be things that we'll have to do more for as we go further and further down, as you'll see in a second, but those opportunities still exist even if we've chosen the devolution of man. So it's not all doom and gloom. Even if we go through the sidereia, and even if it's time's gone, there is still that opportunity. We still have that scope. And that's why scope is so important, because it provides us with that opportunity to transcend. And of course, that's what we relate to the devolution of man here, is that by means of scope, we can get back to the placement of man, even if we're at the devolution. But if we choose not to do that, actually, first, before I talk about that, There's just that arrow there that points from the devolution of man there straight to starfall, which is that if the comet of death event imminently occurs. So as you'll see at the other side, we've already spoken about the comet of death up on the blue column there, the third one down. That is an inevitable event. The devolution of man, it says that the crepusculus will be skipped if that end time event happens before the crepusculus can even take place. So if we've chosen not to transcend and we've gone into the devolution, that there may well exist an imminent end time event that will lead straight to starfall, that will lead straight to our extinction, essentially. But if that doesn't happen, and we continue on this path of devolution, we continue on this downward path, we come to what we call the crepusculus. And it's not a nice word, as I said before. It's sort of like a crepusculus. It's like kind of like it's not a nice word. It's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be a nice word. It relates to humanity's the eventuality, the inevitability that humanity will begin to infight, that we will begin to, by staying on this planet, that the resources will eventually go out and they will be gone, and that really we need to we will then have to start fighting each other in order to survive. Doesn't sound very good, does it? Of course, that's what it will lead to if we don't transcend. However, there is another arrow there, as you can see, that I've put. And of course, what I've put there is the possibility of a rescope. So, of course, if we go back to the scope of man, that this sort of connection to the astronomical world, this sort of due to preferment, and that has provided us with the opportunities, that has provided us with the sort of destiny, really, to explore the astronomical world, that opportunity, that scope to do that. When we get to the crepusculus, our opportunities have become so, our scope has become so damaged. Scope is something that needs to be taken care of. The opportunities that we have must be taken care of. They're not something that is just going to exist forever, that can just be thrust to one side and that we don't, take care of. This is what we call the rescope. That due to the original preferment of man, due to our original preferred condition or preferred status in the cosmos, from the beginning there, like I've put the scope of man due to the preferment, the original scope of man, the original preferment, due to that there could exist the possibility for a rescope. So a new scope of man occurs, a new understanding, a new engagement with astronauty, a new path to transcension may emerge, but that is a possibility. It is not an eventuality, and that's the difference there. That's the difference between when we talk about the arrows from the devolution of man, that is our choice, but when we get to the crepusculus, the rescope is not our choice. That is the cosmos providing us with another opportunity, another scope of man, a second scope of man, or a rescope, to get back to that path of transcension again. So that is not something that is under our control. That will just happen, possibly, by the fate of the cosmos. If that is our fate, then that will happen, and we will return back to the scope of man there. So, of course, we may go back through that cycle may go over again, and we may keep going through this cycle all the time. The key thing is, of course, astronism and the placement of man and the choosing of the right decision at Twilightide to transcend. That's what gets us out of this sort of cycle here, that sort of goes down into the degradation. And then, of course, from the crepusculus, from this infighting, from this lack of resources, from this sort of need to fight each other to survive, that's going to lead to our extinction. So what we call extinction in the extinction of humanity, or really any species in astronomism, is the starfall. Okay, we call it starfall. And just one little side note here, this diagram can be applied to any species. This is, of course, this is related to humanity because that's what I'm talking about right now. But this can be related to any species in the cosmos that has undergone its scope, that has undergone its transition from sentience to sapience. Okay, so that's just a little side note there. So, of course, starfall occurs and then humanity goes extinct, and that's it. And then that's our story gone. The astronomical world will continue. The comet of death may occur. The great tumefaction will definitely occur. We know that. Siberia will definitely occur. We know that by the limited capacities of the limited nature of the cosmos. We know those things are going to happen. It's whether humanity is still existent at those times or not. That's the question. Of course, what starfall, reaching that starfall, is saying is that humanity won't be, that humanity will be extinct because it has undergone the degradation and it has undergone that sort of downward spiral to what we call the starfall, the sort of end times of astronism, this sort of very violent, horrible, infighting times of humanity, not astronism. And of course, that will lead to the starfall. So that is the kind of the end game, really, of the process of the degradation. Okay. So we've done the red part there. Also, just another side note, there are some keywords there, as you'll see in the box above the degradation. So you can use those as well. Of course, I'm giving you the definitions in real time here, but you can take a look at those written definitions of the same words if you prefer. So we've done the red part, we've done the degradation, that's the horrible part, that's the part that astronism doesn't want us to get to. And of course, now we'll move on to, we'll return really to the Twilightide, but we'll return to what we call the Transcension. And this is the most exciting part. This is the part where astronism wants us to get to, okay? So, well now, of course, we've got this condition of Vesperia, which is, of course, the decision to transcend. Vesperism or Vesperia is the decision to transcend into the astronomical world, okay? So that is the decision that, of course, all astronists want humanity to choose in the right way, in a placed way, in a way that we understand our placement in the cosmos way, okay? I mentioned before the idea of the star eyes, this third option from that is merging out of the Twilightide there. And of course, this is what we call star eyes. This is connected to the belief of analyticism, which is essentially the belief that humanity has already overcome the choices at Twilightide. And so the elevation of man has already begun. So that is a very small branch of astronists who may believe that, or just people in general. They don't have to be astronists who believe that. Really, we've overcome Twilightide. You know, the Astronist orthodoxy, of course, teaches that we're not even close to Twilightide yet. But there are some people who believe that we've already overcome Twilightide, and this is what we call star eyes. Okay, this idea that we're already there. We don't need to make the decision at Twilightide because we've already started the Transcension endeavour. We've already started that through space exploration, through space expansion that we're already taking place now. Okay, so there is some justification for that in the real world right now. But of course, that is disregarding what astronism is trying to say about the placement of man. It's sort of skipping over that essentially. But let's return to the Vesperia. So, of course, Vesperia is this endeavour to, this is the choice of Twilightide of transcension, to transcend to the astronomical world. This is what we're going to, and then, of course, that will lead on to what we call the Astronomical Revolution. As you can see here, this box on transcension has been split into two triangles, essentially, hasn't it? Really, where there is transcension and then there is elevation. Transcension here, of course, refers to that great struggle, the struggle for salvation in the astronomical world. That's what transcension refers to. Whereas elevation is really the things that humanity is doing to achieve that transcension, to achieve that state of transcension that we will get to eventually through the elevation of man. Okay. Of course, leading on from Vesperia, what will take place then is the Astronomical Revolution, which is, of course, involves the spacefaring revolution, the idea that humanity will become a spacefaring species by that point, that humanity will, of course, this is all in the future. You know, this is the future possibilities, opportunities that we have, the future scopes. There is so the Astronomical Revolution there is a very key point, of course. In leading to this space expansion, essentially. What we refer to, and the two arrows that are, the arrow that's coming off there and going to sort of like that way, is what we call mobilization. So this is humanity actually doing things to speed up the transcension, essentially. And this is, of course, what we call elevation, or the elevation of man, using things like astronality, as I've listed there, astronomical elixirs, indracy, subsumption, transhumans, this idea that we will be different types of humans, that we will not be that we will not have the same limitations that we have when we get to this stage, both physiologically, but also emotionally and intellectually and spiritually, perhaps. So again, all these things here in that box is what astronism's talking about, isn't it? I talk all the time about stellancy, about astronality, these things that we have, these tools that we have to get us to this point of transcension, to get us through this endeavour of transcension, essentially. So, of course, the Great Departation is part of, or a subsequence of, the Astronomical Revolution. The Great Departation entails sort of humanity's mass exodus of the planet Earth, essentially. That not all humanity will leave, but a great deal of humanity will expand out of the Earth and move into different planets, different solar systems, maybe even different galaxies eventually. That's very, very far in the future, of course. And of course, there's this massive arrow there that is moving off from all those things that I've listed and merging together with the Great Departation, and eventually then leads to this next section of the transcension, which is what we call the grand world. But before we get to that, I put there undisclosure, that little box, that red part that says undisclosure. The word that we use for the reason why we use that word undisclosure is because there may be things in the future that I have not foreseen on this diagram here that may occur that may negatively affect transcension. Okay, so there may be famines, there may be other things that humanity does that I've not foreseen yet that will lead to our degradation. Decisions that we may make that are undisclosed at this stage. And so that's why I put undisclosure there. That's why we use that word to refer to anything that is unknown. It's kind of like a question mark in a sense as to if we're going to achieve grand world, there will be things that might take place. We need to be able to overcome those, okay? But we'll only know that when we actually get there and experience these things. But we use the word undisclosure to refer to that. So then we reach the grand world, don't we? And really the grand world, you know, we're moving up this, on the side there, on this side, we're moving up there. And really the grand world is really a utopian existence where we've achieved this state of transcension, as you can see there, that condition of transcension, we've achieved that. And we're a spacefaring species, we are enjoying the fruits of transcension. But then we come to this, probably the most elusive concept in all of astronism, which is what we call the ultimation, which is essentially the kind of really the perpetuation. Sorry, I was just checking if I spelled that right. Really, the ultimate condition of the ultimate being, the ultimate condition, the ultimate way of being, whatever that is, has to come through the grand world first. We have to reach that in order to then understand, or even begin to understand, what the ultimation may be. So the grand world, its perpetuation is really important to that. As you can see, I've put that there. And also above that, then we lead on to the realization of what the ultimation is. I have some idea of what the ultimation is, usually we call it transcosmization, you know, leaving the cosmos eventually, changing our natures, becoming infinite rather than limited. But of course, you know, I don't really know for certain what the ultimation is, because I'm still talking to you about this as we're in this controversion stage right down at the bottom there. So I can't even pretend to know what the ultimation is, and I'd be lying to you if I said I did. All I can do is trying to presume, or from my very limited understanding right now, as to what that is. What I believe is that when we get to the grand world, when we get to that status, we will then realize what the ultimation is and be able to endeavor to get it. Going off from the grand world into that sort of semi-golden, yellowy kind of box there is what we call omnisation. And essentially what omnisation is the spreading of astronism to other species. So of course, astronism is a human religion. It's something that I've created, that has developed through the conditions of humanity in our history, but that there is opportunities for astronism to be disseminated to other species in the future, which is what we call omnisation. And this is what we call chorification as well, the condition of being of chorification or choricity, which is that essentially that astronism is able to continue on. The message of the opportunity of astronism is able to continue on. The opportunities of scope can continue on through humanity's spreading of astronism to other species. So even if humanity goes extinct by what we call the undisclosure there, or anything really that's part of life, or just the undisclosure, the message of opportunity, the message of scope, astronism will continue on, and maybe another species will be able to get to the ultimation, but they may not have been able to do so without first humanity being able to do that, without first humanity have got to that condition of transcension. Okay. And of course, the arrow there points back to that I've said omnisation may cause a setback in transcension. So the species that we may spread astronism to, maybe not as developed as humanity, maybe not at the same stage that humanity was at, maybe hadn't achieved the grand world at that stage. So, you know, they will have to go through the process of transcension again. Just like humanity did, and maybe hopefully they will be able to survive for long enough, or that they will be able to perpetuate the grand world for long enough in order to then realize the ultimation and perhaps attain it. So that is the essence really of astronism. That is astronism really, the soteriology and eschatology of astronism for all humanity, on one slide now in one video. And of course, I've explained this will develop on. This is only Major Astronist Mechanism 1. This will develop further, probably become more complicated. I know that seems quite hard to understand right now, because it's just taken me almost an hour to try and just explain this one diagram, but this is a complex process. That's all I can say, that transcension is not a simple process, and that it requires all of these different stages, I think, in order to achieve that, in order to realistically achieve what we're trying to achieve through transcension. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'm sure you've got plenty of questions, so ask those in the comments, or just make any type of critical, neutral, or pro-astronist comment in the box below, in the comment section below, and I will see you in the next video.